Little is known about Richard Puryear's life prior to 1894. He was a black man around 35 years old who had worked as a foreman for a gang of track laborers on the Wilkes-Barre and Eastern Railroad. Before relocating to northeastern Pennsylvania to work on the railroad, Puryear lived in Virginia. According to the Boston Daily Globe, he was one of many black Southerners who had recently migrated north to work on the railroad. After the railroad's completion, many stayed behind, living in makeshift camps along the route. This influx of black migrants was blamed for an alleged increase in crime, fueling racial tensions in Stroudsburg and surrounding areas. On the evening of February 23, 1894, in the village of Tannersville, Christian Elhers, a middle-aged white shopkeeper, invited Puryear into his home to discuss routine matters. The two men had known each other and had done business together for more than a year. Inside the house, Puryear allegedly shot and killed Ehlers, and severely wounded Ehlers' wife, Louisa. He was also accused of stealing $35 before fleeing the scene. Puryear was arrested the next day, charged with murder, and jailed in Monroe County, in downtown Stroudsburg. On the afternoon of March 1st, Sheriff J.M. Kresge received reports of a lynch mob forming about 10 miles outside of Stroudsburg. Acting swiftly, he deputized 25 men, armed them, and stationed them around the jail for protection. The mob arrived in Stroudsburg at 12:30 a.m. on March 2nd, reaching the jail around 1 a.m. Many of the mob members were reportedly intoxicated. They broke into a blacksmith's shop, stealing sledgehammers and chisels to break into Richard Puryear's cell. Though the mob was said to be led by neighbors of Christian Ehlers, the New York Times named two ringleaders: James W. Wilson, a merchant from Mount Pocono, and Luther M. Michaels, a farmer from Shawnee, both living miles away from where the crime occurred. Outside the jail, local figures, including former Congressman John B. Storm, Mayor C. L. Edinger, and District Attorney John B. Williams, tried to calm the crowd. However, the mob shouting "Hang him" attempted to break down the jail doors using wooden planks as battering rams. Law enforcement eventually repelled them using clubs, forcing the crowd to disperse. During the chaos, 50 mob members were injured, suffering black eyes, bruises, and at least one broken nose. Inside the jail, deputies had orders to open fire if the mob succeeded in breaking through. One of the ringleaders, James Wilson, was arrested and held in the same jail as Puryear. Though the mob threatened to return, the New York Times expressed confidence that the authorities could handle any further unrest. Ultimately, no second attack took place. On March 14th, Richard Puryear managed to pry open his cell door and slip into the jail corridor, where he hid in an empty room. The next morning, as Sheriff Kresge arrived to serve breakfast, Puryear seized his chance. At 7 o'clock, while the sheriff was setting down the prisoners' plates, Puryear slipped out through the open door, locked Kresge inside, and fled. He dashed through the sheriff's kitchen, out of the jail, and sprinted through the streets crowded with men heading to work, trying to escape into the woods outside Stroudsburg. Courthouse janitor William Van Gerder spotted Puryear and raised the alarm, prompting over a dozen men to join the chase down Main Street. As Puryear neared Pocono Creek, a man named Benjamin Burns cut him off. Benjamin, a black man who had known Puryear since childhood in Virginia and had worked with him on the railroad, was now employed at Palmer's slaughterhouse nearby. Puryear swam across the fast-moving creek but emerged exhausted on the other side. He tried to hide in laurel bushes while the pursuers fired at him. Armed with a revolver given to him by his employer, Burns captured Puryear and marched him back to the growing mob, which now numbered between 50 and 200 people. As the mob shouted "Lynch him," Puryear did not resist and either remained silent or said, "Do as you please." The mob quickly procured a block and tackle used for hoisting slaughtered cattle and mounted it on a sturdy oak or maple tree near the creek. Without delay, they dragged Puryear to the tree, placed a noose around his neck, and hoisted him into the air. His head struck a tree limb, possibly knocking him unconscious, as his body immediately went limp. Puryear was dead within 20 minutes of his escape. The pursuit had covered about a mile before he was caught. Puryear's body hung from the tree until 10 o'clock that morning, while hundreds of townspeople, including women and children, gathered to gawk and collect souvenirs. The crowd took up a collection for Burns, awarding him $15 along with the rope used to hang Puryear. Burns cut the rope into pieces and sold them to spectators for 25 cents each. A reporter later found him trying to sell the knot for $1.50. Nearly 3 hours after the lynching, Monroe County authorities ordered Puryear's body to be cut down and taken to the jail. His remains were placed in a coffin and, on March 16th, publicly displayed in the jail corridor, where thousands of people came to view his body. Residents of Stroudsburg objected to burying Puryear in the town cemetery, so according to a report in the Pocono Record, the body was sent by express to George Willett, Philadelphia, to be used at the University of Pennsylvania for dissecting purposes. George H. Smith was reportedly unpopular in Ransomville, with the Buffalo Times calling him one of the roughest characters ever to infest this community. A 45-year-old white man, an immigrant from England, Smith was frequently unemployed and known for his heavy drinking. He had married Robert Clapsaddle's eldest daughter, and they had a 12-year-old son together, but she later divorced him and remarried a local man, John DeClute. Before the events of January 10th, Smith had been arrested 3 times, twice for assaulting his former father-in-law, whom he accused of alienating his wife's affections. More recently, he had been convicted of perjury in an unrelated case and sentenced to 5 years in Auburn prison, from which he was released on November 1, 1895. At 1 p.m. on Friday, January 10th, George H. Smith allegedly slipped into the home of his 68-year-old father-in-law, Robert Clapsaddle, a well-regarded farmer described by newspapers as living in moderate circumstances. Clapsaddle resided in a secluded cottage a mile south of Ransomville with his wife, youngest daughter, and grandson, Smith's son. Smith reportedly shot Clapsaddle in the head with a .38 caliber revolver before fleeing the scene. The farmer's youngest daughter witnessed the shooting, and Clapsaddle died within half an hour, just minutes after a doctor arrived. Smith then headed cross-country towards the DeClute residence, 2 miles away, sparking fears that he planned to kill his ex-wife and her new husband. News of the murder spread quickly, and a posse of 50 to 75 men, led by a police constable and 3 deputies, was soon formed. Armed with rifles, shotguns, revolvers, and clubs, they pursued George H. Smith. By 4 p.m., they caught up with him about a quarter of a mile from the DeClute residence, where Smith had taken refuge in a nearby farmer's house. During the standoff, Smith shot and wounded one of his pursuers, Elmer Clapsaddle, a distant relative of his victim, striking him in the wrist. The posse called for Smith to surrender, and when he refused, they opened fire on the house. After several minutes of gunfire, the men stormed the building and found Smith on the floor, bleeding and unconscious, his body riddled with 20 bullets or buckshot. The fatal wound was reportedly a bullet to the head. Despite receiving medical attention, Smith died around midnight. According to the Buffalo News, he briefly regained consciousness before his death and defiantly uttered his last words, "You can't get me alive, damn you, I am nearly dead." On January 13th, Ransomville held an inquest into George H. Smith's death. The coroner ruled that Smith had committed suicide by shooting himself in the head with his own revolver, despite the numerous injuries inflicted by the posse's gunfire. This verdict served the community well, as it helped avoid potential prosecution for the vigilante killing and the stigma of being associated with a lynching. As one historian noted, rather than facing the challenges of defending their decision to lynch a white man, they opted to conceal the act and frame it as a suicide. Sam Hose, originally named Tom Wilkes, was born around 1875 in South Georgia near Marshallville, Macon County. He was raised on a farm owned by the Jones family, who had previously enslaved his mother. Those who knew Hose described him as friendly and intelligent, and, unlike many black men in the South during the 19th century, he was able to read and write. Hose took on the responsibility of caring for his aging mother and his brother, who had an intellectual disability, which led him to abandon his ambitions for higher education and work as a manual laborer. In 1899, newspapers reported that Wilkes had left Marshallville and adopted the alias Sam Hose after being accused of assaulting an elderly black woman. Wilkes moved to Coweta County, where he adopted the alias Sam Hose. On April 12, 1899, he was accused of killing his employer, Alfred Cranford, following a heated argument. Hose had asked for time off to visit his ailing mother, and according to his account, Cranford threatened to kill him and pointed a revolver at him. At the time, Hose was holding an axe and claimed he acted in self-defense, throwing the axe and killing Cranford. Hose fled the scene, prompting a widespread manhunt. 5 cash rewards were offered for his capture, including by then-Governor Allen Candler, the Atlanta Constitution, Coweta County, the town of Palmetto, and Jacob Hass of Atlanta. In the following days, rumors spread, inflaming public outrage by alleging that Hose had sexually assaulted Cranford's wife, Maddie Cranford, and attacked their infant child. Newspapers sensationalized these accusations, depicting Hose as a monster in human form and falsely claiming he had gleefully assaulted Miss Cranford and their child while Cranford lay dying. Some reports even baselessly suggest Hose had advanced syphilis. Mrs. Cranford consistently maintained that she had been sexually assaulted by Hose, and her youngest son, Clifford Alfred Cranford, was left blind in one eye from the injuries sustained that day. Hose was apprehended on April 23, 1899 in Marshallville and transported back to Coweta County by train. A mob intercepted the train carrying Hose at gunpoint in Newnan, Georgia. Hose was then marched to a local jail, where a disagreement arose between the mob and the sheriff. The mob agreed to hand Hose over to the sheriff if they received the reward money for his capture. However, as the jailer attempted to escort Hose to a cell, the mob panicked, held a gun to the jailer's head, and seized Hose again. Former Governor William Yates Atkinson and Judge Alvin Freeman pleaded with the mob to release Hose into police custody, but their appeals were ignored. The crowd, which had grown to about 500 people, though some reports claim it swelled to 2,000, began moving toward the Cranford home. When word of Hose's capture reached Atlanta, large crowds boarded trains headed for Newnan. Believing these trains carried troops, the mob halted just north of Newnan, deciding they could wait no longer. Hose was taken to a location known as the Old Troutman Field. Reports indicated that members of the mob used knives to mutilate Hose, severing his ears, fingers, and genitals, while others repeatedly stabbed him, cheered on by the crowd. Men and boys gathered kindling from nearby woods to build a pyre. They stripped the skin from Hose's face and doused him with kerosene before chaining him to a pine tree. Mob members then threw matches onto the pyre, igniting it and setting Hose ablaze. As the flames engulfed him, his veins ruptured from the heat and his eyes nearly burst from their sockets. One journalist noted that the crowd watched with unfeigned satisfaction as Hose contorted in agony. As he burned, Hose cried out, "Oh my God, oh Jesus." Nearly 30 minutes passed from the time of his initial injuries until his death. One woman in the crowd expressed gratitude for the mob's actions, while others took pieces of his lifeless body as gruesome souvenirs. Portions of his bones were sold for 25 cents, and his heart and liver were cut out for sale as well.